Some of you already know where this story begins. Several decades ago, Coretta Scott King, the wife of Martin Luther King Jr., sat down with one of my colleagues, Rosemary McBlatt. They were meeting about Coretta considering Rosemary to be the editor of King's writings and his autobiography. In that meeting, Rosemary was shocked and thrilled to discover that Coretta and Martin, during their time in Boston, had considered converting to Unitarianism. See, Martin was trained in liberal religious thinking, and during his time in Boston, it was only natural for him to visit some Unitarian churches, and Coretta shared that they felt really comfortable there and called to be there. For Martin, Unitarianism and liberal religion offered a fresh view and approach to the Bible. He loved that critical reasoning offered a new path into faith, and it affirmed his sense of human potential. There is hope yet, he heard in these messages. And yet, Coretta shared that she and Martin had talked over this decision with care. And they recognized that they had a deep call to work on racial justice and to participate in the civil rights movement. And they knew that they couldn't do that effectively in the South with their Black community from Unitarianism. So this story is both one of validation and lament. There's that thrilling moment when our small minority, often unknown faith, when we could say, Martin Luther King almost chose us. Hallelujah! Can I get a hallelujah? Hallelujah! Woo! I guess we're a pretty good choice. And then that moment of lament, to know that if he had chosen us, the world would have lost one of its best servants. To accept that there are places that our faith doesn't naturally go. Now, when I have heard this story told in Unitarian Universalism, that itself is the whole story. We spend the whole sermon just unpacking that, and there is so much there. But honestly, that is only the beginning of the story. Let me tell you about the theology that King did embrace. It was a philosophical theology predominant at Boston University, where he was doing his PhD program, and it was a school called personalism. Personalism believes not in the personhood of God, but that God had a personality, a character, a sense of an essence that was knowable by us. This was not that different from what our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors talked about, that there was a God that we can know directly, unmitigated, without having to go through an intermediary such as Jesus, and that God in return could know us and did know us and loved us. That this God just didn't love just humanity generally alone, that God didn't just want love to be the way we are with one another, but that God knew every single one of us particularly, knew us and loved us as only an individual who is known can be. That kind of God. Now this God and this articulation of faith sustained and held Martin as he went into his ministry and into the civil rights movement. And that's no small thing to say. My systematic theology professor, James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, said you could only do good theology when your back was against the wall. And in all honesty, up until this point in his first 24 years of life, Martin Luther King Jr. lived a pretty protected life. He was supported and nourished by his parents. They give him access and permission to pursue this wonderful education. And so he hadn't truly been tested. That changed when he accepted ministry at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. 24 years old, and not that long after he was selected to participate in leadership in the Montgomery bus boycott. It didn't take long for the threats to emerge. The phone calls that would ring in his home and his office, the letters that would threaten him and his congregation and his community, his family, even his young children. It's really here, even more than earlier, that he began to critique the liberal religion that had called him, a tradition that included Unitarianism. See, he began to see in these threats and this pushback that while critical reasoning was a path into faith, that reason with itself, ungrounded by faith or values, could just be a tool to rationalize or justify one's own immoral behavior. And more, even though he never went so far as to say human beings were innately sinnable or not redeemable, he was no longer so naive to just say that we're innately good. He saw that while we were capable of goodness, we also had a capacity to do evil. Here was this young man being tested and tried in a way he couldn't have imagined. Less than a year into the Montgomery bus boycott, he was honestly ready to quit. He was so drained and exhausted and despairing about the nature of humanity, fearful of the cost, particularly to his family. There was one night, as was custom, he went to bed late. Coretta already asleep in the bed next to him, trying to calm down enough to fall asleep when, of course, the phone rings. And an angry voice says to him, "We've taken all we're going to take from you. By the end of the week, you'll regret ever having come to Montgomery." He couldn't shake it. He was so fearful that he got out of bed, and I don't recommend this, he made a pot of coffee. He started pacing back and forth in his house, trying to figure out how he could say no to this work. Finally, he sat down at the small kitchen table, the ones that were kind of rimmed and that aluminum and kind of had that linoleum composite on it, you know those tables? And he put his head in his hand and he prayed. He said, "I am trying to do what I believe is right. People are looking to me for leadership, but if I show up without strength and courage, they will falter. I am afraid. I have nothing left. I cannot face this alone. In that moment, he felt a presence of God like he had never had before. He felt his worries leave him and a sense of peace come into his spirit. And he heard these words, he said in a quiet inner voice, "Stand for righteousness, work for justice. God will be at your side forever." He felt his uncertainty drop away. He felt like he could do anything. He recognized that while the outer circumstances had not changed, he had changed and had been renewed. 3 days later, he was at a local church doing an appeal, gathering money and doing some planning when the news came. His house with his children, a baby in the master bedroom, had been bombed. He rushed home as fast as he could, barely even taking a breath. And when he got there, he discovered his family was all right. Blessed be. But 300 to 500 members of the Black community had gathered for retaliation with guns and knives, hoes and sticks and pitchforks. They were angry and ready. And so he came out in front of his house and faced them and their murmuring. And all he did was raise his hand. That hand said, "Peace, be still. Those that liveth by the sword die by the sword." We have to offer love to our white sisters and brothers, even if they don't offer it to us. Go home. And the people went home, and there was peace for the rest of their life. Sorry, the rest of the night. Hopefully the rest of their life. For so long, since I was a child, I really wondered, how did King find that courage? How did King find that capacity to love? How could he have discovered the way to be an instrument of peace in such a broken, tender world? And I found my answer. The answer is just a simple word: yes. King said yes to prayer, to taking his worries and his burdens to a kitchen table and surrendering them to a God that he thought but truly did not know existed. He said yes to that God that he learned about earlier. Do you remember that God? That God who we can know, the God who can know us, the God who knows us not just generally, the God who brings love into the world, love that we know in public is called justice, the love for us particularly as individuals in our uniqueness. King said yes to that God, the God that our tradition has espoused as true for hundreds of years. King said yes to what that call of love required of him. He said yes to being an instrument of peace and an agent of nonviolence. My spiritual companions, let me ask you, what are you waiting to say yes to? How has love shown up in your life? Whose face does it have? What words has it offered to you? What animating force has been with you in those midnight hours of soul searching? How are you going to answer and live out what is required of thee? Are you willing to embrace this love, be given this courage, and serve out your purpose? Will your heart and soul say yes? Let it say yes.